I'm sorry for scaring everyone yesterday with telling you how hard the Gemara is. It's not crazy hard. It's just that it's hard to wrap our head around. But I don't think it's like the principles are there. It's just that it's when it comes to Tuma and Tara, there's new ideas, which makes it a little bit hard, but the idea is not crazy complex. The other piece is that we don't always understand the why with Tuma and Tara. It's more about the what. This is what the Torah says, and so it's more about understanding getting an understanding of the what as opposed to the why. Okay, with that in mind, let's begin. We are on Yud Dalid Amud Aleph by the Mishnah, 14a2 by the Mishnah, bottom line of the page. Rav Chanina Skan HaKonim Omer. Rav Chanina, who is the Skan of the Kohanim. Skan of Kohanim is basically like the chief of staff. He is like next in line after the Kohen Gadol, and he was a scholar. And he said like this, he reported about something, again, keep in mind that the Mishnayos are being written after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Rav Chanina Skan HaKohanim is reporting something that took place while the Beis HaMikdash was standing, and he said, Mimeim shel Kohanim, in all the days of the Kohanim, meaning while the Beis HaMikdash still stood, okay, Lo nimnu melisruf es habasar shenitma bivlad hatuma, they never refrained from burning meat, sacrificial meat of a karban that had been contaminated by a derived tuma. Okay, what does that mean? So basically, when it comes to tuma, there are levels of tuma. You have ava tuma, avi avosa tuma. You have an ava tuma, okay, literally a father of tuma, and then something comes into contact with the ava tuma. When something comes into contact with the ava tuma, becomes a rishon l'tuma, first degree tame, and then something comes into contact with the rishon l'tuma, becomes a sheni l'tuma, second degree of tuma, and something comes into contact with the second degree, becomes a shlish l'tuma, third degree tuma. Okay, now there are exceptions and rules, but the point is that you have that chain of command or chain. Okay, so the Gemara says that if they had something that was contaminated by a derived tuma means it's already a first level tuma, right? So you had something which became contaminated by something, meaning it came into contact with something which was a first degree tuma. So if there's a first degree tuma and it touched something else, what does that something else become? Sheni, a second degree tuma. So you have something which is a second degree tuma, which comes into contact with something which came into contact with a father of tuma. So what is something which comes into contact with the father of tuma? A rishon tuma, first degree. So you have a first degree and a second degree tuma. You have sacrificial meat, which is first degree and second degree tame, and they are burnt together. They're burnt together, even though they're going to become in contact with one another, okay? We'll talk about what the novelty is over here, but the point is that the Mishnah is telling us that although these are on different levels of tumah, when they have to burn them, they did not separate their burning, but rather they burnt them together. Even though they're going to be in contact with one another, right? And that's what the Gemara says, Afal Pisha Mosifim Tuma al Tumaso. Even though by burning them together, the second degree comes into contact with the first degree, and there is an added degree of tumah that is going to be generated. Now, if you're thinking through this, there actually isn't an added degree of tumah which gets generated, but we'll come back to that point. But the point is that you see there are things on different levels that are being put together. Even though they're on different levels, we're not concerned about that, okay? Host of Rabbi Kiva Omer, Rabbi Kiva adds and says, Mimeim shel Kohanim, in all the days of the Kohanim, again, that term, which is basically means while the base understood, Lo nimnu melahalik es hashemen shenifsal b'tvul yom, they never refrain from lighting oil of truma, okay, oil of truma, right? Truma is sanctified, quasi-sanctified. It's a tithe. It's something which you have to separate for the kohanim. So oil of truma that became unfit. How did it become unfit? Through contact with a tvul yom. A tvul yom is someone who went through the purification process, but they are waiting and they went to the mikvah. But the days of truma are not over, and therefore, meaning, let's say on the seventh day of their impurity, they went to the mikvah, but they only become pure at the end of that day. That's called a tvul yom. So oil that comes into contact with a tvul yom becomes a shlishi l'tuma, okay, third degree tame, okay, b'ner shnitma mitzvei meis, and they burnt it in a lamp that had been contaminated by a person who was tame from a corpse. Okay, a corpse is a rishon. A person who comes to contact with a corpse is a rishon l'tuma. So we're saying is the oil is a shlishi l'tuma, third degree tame, and they put it in a lamp which was a first degree tuma. Afa pishim osifin tuma al tuma. So even though in doing so they add a degree of tuma to its previous tuma, right? In other words, if you have something which was a shlishi and you put it in a rishon, what happens to the shlishi, to the oil? It becomes a sheni. Okay, so there we understand that basically we're saying even though we've increased tuma in the world, we've generated more tuma in the world because you took that shlishi, the oil that was the third degree, you put it in a lamp which was a first degree, and in doing so that oil became a second degree impure. Okay? Amrav Meir adds from these statements above, midivrehem lamanu, from their words we learn, from the fact that we are allowing a elevation of tuma In other words, going from one lower level to a higher level deliberately, and which is something which in general we want to avoid. Okay, we generally don't want to make things tamei, something which happens. So we should learn from there, and this is why we're learning this in this next line. We're learning this in Pesachim is shesorfen truma tahora im hatmea bepesach, that you'd be allowed to burn tahar chametz of truma together with tamei truma on Erev Pesach. Okay, so what this means is as follows.
You're not talking about karbonos, you're talking about burning.
Correct. Yeah, you don't want being a tummy one to the yeah. So now so Rabbi Meir is extending this to truma. Now truma is the stuff we give to you, to the kohanim, right? And you have truma, which is tamei, okay, and it's tamei. So normally tamei stuff you're gonna burn, fine. But when it comes to tar truma, there's actually prohibition. We spoke about this earlier, that you're not allowed to make it tamei. You're not allowed to make it tamei. The question is, what about now? Over here, I'm about to. It's Erev Pesach. It's chametz. So I'm about to be in a situation where I have to burn it anyways, right? So when I'm about burn, because it's going to be forbidden to benefit from shortly, right? I can't have any ownership of it shortly. So in this state, meaning if it was just a regular today, if someone had truma tahora, I would not and you'd say, are you allowed to take your truma tahora and put it in contact with your truma tmeya? Absolutely not. That'd be a prohibition. You're not allowed to do that. But what about on Erev Pesach, where anyways it's going to become usher in a few moments? Are you allowed to go does the general prohibition that tells you, Hishamer, be careful not to burn the tamei truma, not to contaminate the truma tahora. There's a general prohibition against contaminating it. Does that get waived in a situation where it's about to become usher anyways because of Pesach? That is what Rameir is saying. It does get waived, just like in those cases above. You're burning you're allowed to elevate the level of tumah because it has to be burnt anyways. You have to get rid of it anyways. So too, you could infer from there that you could take truma tmeya, which is chametz, and you could burn it together truma to hora, which is chametz, because even though normally you would not be allowed to do so, but over here, since anyways you no longer have the prohibition, the prohibition against making a tummy, that would not apply over here on Erev Pesach. That's Rameir's position. Good, okay. However, not everyone agrees. Amar Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi says, "Inahi amida." It's not. There's no analogy over here. Why? Umodim. Because Rav Yossi continues. He says, "Umodim Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua." There is going to be a debate. We're going to see soon, not yet, between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and they have a debate about truma tahora and truma tameya, and they would agree in our case, shesorfin zola atzma v'zola atzma. They would agree in our case, when it comes to truma tahora and truma tameya, they would burn each separately. Amen nachlu. What do they disagree about? And again, we haven't seen their disagreements yet, and we'll unpack it more. Alatziluya v'alatameya. They're not talking about truma tahora and truma tameya, in which they have a debate. Rather, talking about suspended truma. What is suspended truma? That means truma which there's a suffix, there's a doubt. Maybe it's tamei, maybe it's tahar. Burning that with tamei truma. Rabbi Eliezer says when it's one is suffix, one is a doubt, and one is definitely tamei, they still have to be burned separately. Rabbi Yeshua Omer shteim ba'achas ka'achas. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Once one is a doubt, you're allowed to burn it together with the one that is completely tamei. But they would both agree, says Rabbi Yossi, that when one is 100% tahar, 100% tahar, you would not be allowed to burn it together with that's tamei, even though it's Erev Pesach. Okay, good. Makes sense? Fine. So now the Gemara is going to unpack each passage of this Mishnah. So Michli. Okay, before we get back to Chametz, we first have to analyze some of the laws of Tumah that were mentioned over here. So let's see. Basar shnitban bevlada Tumah, my have. Okay, so again, the Mishnah said, remember, the first line of the Mishnah said, from Rav Chanina Skana Kohanim, he said that meat that was contaminated by a derived tumah. So that means that it was something that was a derived tumah, which is a first degree, and there's meat that came into contact with the derived tumah, which means now it's no longer a first degree. That meat is now a second degree, is allowed to be burnt together with something that is a first degree. Okay, that's what the Mishnah said. Second degree can be burnt with the first degree. So where it says, Basar shnim bevlada tumah my have. So when the Mishnah said that it's tumah, that the meat was contaminated by a derived tumah, what level of tumah is it then? It's a sheni. Okay? So you burn a sheni, a second degree, together with meat that was contaminated by avatuma, which is a first degree, my have. What change happens? It becomes a sheni. Okay? In other words, it's if you have something which is a first degree, and it comes in contact with the first degree, what happens to it? It becomes right. Item number one is a first degree, okay? Item number two comes into contact with it. What does the item number two become? A second degree, right? So, but this thing is already a second degree. So what's happening, right? Sheni, right? Sheni v'sheni hu. It's a second degree, and it's still a second degree, right? Because again, we're talking about an item which was a second degree, and it's being burnt with something which is a first degree. So nothing's happening. It's staying a sheni. It stays as a second degree. So my mosif lo tuma tumasaika. So what was Rav Chanina talking about when he says, even though you're adding a degree of tuma to its previous tuma? It's not true. All you're doing is you're burning it together, but it doesn't change its tuma status, and therefore, what's the problem? What's the novelty? Amar Rav Yehuda. So Gemara says no. There is a detail missing over here. Hacha bivlad askinan. We're actually talking about something which is not a second, something which is, when we said a derived tuma, we're talking about something which was going to become a second degree, but rather dabli shlishi, where there's an extra level. We're actually talking about something which is a third degree. So you have one piece of meat which is a third degree tameh. Okay, it's a derivative of a derivative, not derivative, but derivative of a derivative. So it's a third degree, 2 levels down. Together is something which is a first degree. And what Rav Chanina is teaching us is that the third degree can be burned together with the first degree, even though in doing so, the third degree becomes a sheni, a second degree in the process. That's the novelty. Okay, fine. Ask the Gemara, wait a second. There is a law that food cannot convey tuma to another food. Okay, so they're different now. We're not going to get into all the details. I don't know if you had a chance to read the introduction to this chapter, which is a worthy read. But the point is that the Torah tells us, as we're about to see now a source, that food cannot contaminate other food. Okay, meaning certain things could contaminate, certain things can't, but a solid food item cannot contaminate another solid food item. That's a rule. Okay, as we're about to see, the time was starting the brisa. Yachol yehei ochel matame ochel. You would have thought that a solid food can convey tuma to another solid food. Tamalom Torah says no. Why? The pasuk says v'chiyutan mayim al zera. When water has been placed on a seed, okay, so that is the prerequisite for anything to be mekabel tuma. It has to first have something, a liquid poured on it. Okay, so when the seed that has been harvested has water poured on it, v'nafal menivlasam alav, and then a nevela, a carcass of a sheret, of an animal which is metame, which causes impurity, falls on it, comes into contact with it, tame hu. Then the food, we're now on 14a4, then the seed becomes tame. And the Gemara, the Bryson first from there, hu tame, okay, the seed becomes tame, vein os e kayotze vo tame. But the seed cannot make something else of its nature, i.e. another food, tame. So you learn from that Brysa that a solid food cannot make another solid food tame. So the Gemara asks, what are we even talking about over here? You're saying, I'm burning the first degree with the third degree, and therefore it's coming a second degree. It's not true, because they're both solid foods, and nothing should become tame. So
why is the Gemara written this way? It's sort of like written backwards.
Why?
Well, because first it's telling me what I can do, what I can't do, and then it's turning around and saying, well, it's really okay because food can't contaminate another food.
Well, the Mishnah said you can't do it. The Mishnah said, you're making it in a second. You're changing it to tame status. The Gemara is asking, what are you talking about? It's not true. Yeah. Okay, so Gemara says, Amar. So Gemara says, okay, this question we ask is not going to be a question for everyone. Why? Because Abaye, there's no question if you hold like Abaye. What does Abaye hold? Loshana b'chulin. That this idea that solid foods cannot contaminate another solid food is only with chulin. Okay, meaning non-consecrated food. Aval b'truma v'kachim osa kayoteva. When it comes to truma and kachim is sacrificial food. Truma is food which is separated for the Kohen. There, a tummy food can make something of another tummy food, something else tummy. In other words, and it can make another solid tummy. Okay, what's this based on? We'll get there soon. But there's a pasuk in the Navi, in Chagai, which speaks about this, about solids making solids tummy. And we have a discussion over there what it's referring to. So Abaye says it's actually referring to truma and kachim. Okay, and therefore, meaning those two types of sanctified or quasi-sanctified food, and therefore there's no question because he actually holds that the Torah says you are able to make a solid food tameh by coming into contact with another solid food. Okay, and therefore we're talking over here about sacrificial foods, and therefore it's kachim, and therefore this would make sense. There's no problem because he does hold that although that pasuk says you can't make one food, can't make another food tameh, that's only with chulin. But we're not talking about chulin, regular non-consecrated food. We're talking about consecrated food. Okay, so Gemara says further, Rav Ada bar Hava mishmei de Rava nami de Amar. According to him as well, it's okay because he says that the pasuk we just read above is loshana l'chulin truma. It's referring to both unconsecrated food and even truma. Aval bekachim osak yoten. When it comes to kachim, sacrificial food, then a solid could make a solid tameh, and therefore again, since we're talking about sacrificial food, also no question. Shapir. It's good. El Ravina Mishmeda Rava, but according to Ravina in the name of Rava, who said Udamar Mikra Mali Dibar Kasaf, that the Torah stated unqualified teaching that said Loshna Chulin, Loshna Truma, Loshna Kachim, that this law of a solid not being able to contaminate the solid is true for all types of food. It cannot make something else tameh. Okay, Michael Maimar. Again, how do we understand that the Mishnah said even though the foods come into contact, even though you're making tumah, etc., the Gemara is questioning, it's not true, at least according to him. So the Gemara says, we're talking about a case where there is meat, but there's also liquid on it. Okay, meaning that we learned above that you cannot, that one solid can make another solid tameh. That's only solid and solid. But if there's a liquid on top of it, let's say a person put a whole bunch of barbecue sauce on it. There's
but meat is liquid anyway. I mean, it's
correct. It would have to be an external liquid. It would have to be external liquid, right? Not the liquid itself. So that's why the barbecue sauce. And so basically, there's a liquid there as well. Then then the meat can become tameh. So you have meat number one, which is a rishon, first degree. Meat number two, which is a third degree. But they have a liquid there. Okay, then you have the liquid transferring the tumah, the impurity, from item to item. That would actually make it tameh. Ask Gemara, Yachi. So then the terminology we used in our Mishnah is actually a little inaccurate. Hi im habasar shnitma ba'avatuma. Okay, then the Mishnah said that you could do it together with the meat that was contaminated by avatuma. That was the terminology used. What it should have said is im habasar umashkim baile. Together the meat and beverage. In other words, the word beverage is missing. Why, if you're telling me there was really a beverage there, well, say it. Don't just, right? So that's the problem. So Gemara says, Ella, even though Ravina, in the name of Rava, said that food cannot convey food to tumah to another food, that is only biblically. It means rabbinically, it does convey tumah. So this idea, this discussion we had above was all based on a biblical premise. In other words, biblically, one solid food cannot convey tumah to another solid food. Okay? But when it comes to rabbinically, then foods can contaminate other foods, even if there's no liquid there, and that is still the novelty of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is saying that even though normally rabbinically this would be prohibited, over here, because over here we're permitting it, we're permitting to do it, even though normally it would be rabbinically prohibited. Okay, fine. The Gemara goes further. Host Rabbi Kiva. The next line of the Mishnah said Rabbi Kiva added that you're allowed to use the oil, which was a shlishi, third degree, in a lamp. Okay, which so the Gemara says like this. Okay, michti. Let's see. What is the status of oil that became unfit by contact with the tvul yom? Shlishi, third degree. And then you light it in a lamp that was contaminated by a person who was tameh from a corpse. What is the status of someone who was contaminated, who became tameh from? So a person, there's a corpse. Person touches the corpse, becomes a rishon. Then that person touches a lamp. That lamp becomes a second degree. My have sheni, second degree. So my kamash malad. So what are you teaching me? Shlishi mutter laso so sheni. That a third degree may be made into a second degree, right? So Gemara says hainu hach. That's literally the same thing we just said above, right? So basically, what's happening over here is you're taking something which is a third degree and you're making it into a second degree. We're actually dealing with a lamp which is a metal lamp. Okay, and we'll see why that's going to be different. Rahmana Amar. Let's go to 14b1. The halal cherev. In the context of tumah, it said the body of someone who is killed by a sword. Okay, it talks about tumah, talks about impurity, and it says that the body of someone who's killed by a sword. Now, why does it choose to say the person was killed by a sword? Just say the person was killed, the person's dead. Why do you have to say the person was killed by a sword? Cherev teaches cherev haruk echala, that a sword or anything that's metal actually becomes the same level of the body. In other words, if something metal comes into contact with a corpse, it doesn't become a rishon, which is what we're assuming. But rather avatuma becomes the level above that, okay? Because savar shlishi, and therefore what we're saying right now is that it's actually, we're talking about something which is going to be a risha, it's going to be an avatuma, even the highest level. The metal lamp is going to be the highest level, i.e. avatuma. Because savar shlishi, and the oil which was a third degree mutter lasoso rishon, you're allowed to make it into a rishon, which is even more of a novelty, right? In other words, what we're saying now is that the lamp itself is a avatuma because it's metal. Came into contact with the corpse, and therefore it's metal, it's an avatuma, highest level. The oil, we said, was tvul yom, which is a third degree. Rabbi Kiva says you're allowed to put the third degree into an avatuma, which means that the oil now is going from number 3 to number 1, becoming a first degree, which is more novel than the halakha we saw on the stage before, which was a third degree becoming a second degree. Now Rabbi Kiva is adding and saying third degree could even become a second degree. That is also permitted. Okay, the Gemara is going to analyze this a little bit further. We'll pick up, God willing, tomorrow. Have a great day.